what we're going to do in the first half is we're going to run through some of these key critiques of not just the details and the methodology, but the whole premises on which the whole study of economics is based. And then the second half is going to be focusing more on new, exciting ways that are emerging that I think open a real possibility of us doing things quite differently. It's surprising. The second half is relatively new to me as well, but I think we're sitting on just a little anecdote is that the term the Industrial Revolution wasn't coined until about 100 years after the process, in retrospect, could seem to have begun. The message there being that people who live through great social upheavals very frequently don't see it because the language and the stories that they live within are encoded with the ideology of the current system. And so it's only in retrospect. So I'm pretty persuaded that our kids and grandkids will say to us, wow, you lived through that incredible period of utter transformation where everything changed. And I mean, I think that there's a real possibility they will say that, not on the basis that I want them to say that because I'm an optimist, which I am, but actually that there are structural changes happening at the moment that are not appearing on the front pages of the newspaper, that it seems to me really have the possibility that we are living, I think, already through a seismic social and economic revolution that we're not really noticing because the dots aren't being joined up in this way in the language and the stories that the mass media are mirroring back to us. Okay, so that's going to be, the first bit is the critiques that have come in challenging the very basis and premise on which the discipline of economics is taught and practiced, and then looking to the good news emerging stories. Next one, please. So the first critique is one that probably most of you, many of you, I guess most of you will be familiar with, and this is the idea that GDP, gross domestic product, measuring a measure of economic activity is the dominant measure of societal well-being. So this is so deeply encoded in the international story that our presidents, our heads of state get up once a year and say, or rather they used to say, last year the economy grew by 2.7%, and they didn't really need to say any more because that told its own story. And so this idea that money flow is an accurate measure of national well-being is, I mean, it's the area where the critique has been, there's been the longest systematic critique of the economics profession. And interestingly, the guy who actually created GDP, Simon Kuznets, himself said the wealth of a nation can scarcely be inferred from the measure of its national income. So he himself said, you know, don't use this as a proxy for measuring societal well-being. Interestingly, the most poetic and beautiful and powerful critique of GDP came from the 1960s. This is a speech made by Bobby Kennedy. I'm just going to let you read it. Next one. Next one. So there's a whole lot of stuff that is wrapped up that counts to GDP that clearly is not contributing to well-being. Currently, or in recent years, the greatest contributors to global GDP have been the wars in the Middle East, deepwater oil spill, so on and so forth. And in parallel, there are many things that do contribute to societal well-being that are not counted. And this is particularly, I'm a father of young children, and like watching the work of raising children, you know, on which the basis of our civilization depends, is not given a monetary value. So next one. So we're seeing some interesting new kinds of story emerging about this. This is the wonderful Tim Jackson. People are being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. Beginning to redefine, you know, what the good life is. Next one. Yeah. In similar vein, this is a quote that I love. The ideal economic or GDP hero is a chain-smoking terminal cancer patient going through an expensive divorce whose car is totaled on a 20-car pile-up while munching in fast takeout food and chatting on a cell phone. All add to GDP. The GDP villain is a non-smoker, eats home-cooked wholesome meals and cycles to work. We need to make a way of making this sound a bit cooler. This looks a bit earnest, doesn't it? So, like a big part of the challenge in the new economics is actually working with artists to introduce cool, to make a low impact, high well-being lifestyle, not just worthy but cool. Next one. And again, hit the next one. So this is simply, we're seeing a number of new alternative measures to societal well-being to replace GDP, and there's been a whole wave in recent decades. Human Development Index, Happy Planet Index created by the New Economics Foundation, Gross National Happiness emerging out of the Kingdom of Bhutan, a whole range of different, this is gross domestic, the Genuine Progress Indicator. And this is just like a list of the things that it excludes that are clearly not contributing, and the things that it includes that are currently excluded that really genuinely do add value. By the way, I'm going to leave this presentation with you. So if anybody wants access to the presentation, you can have a copy. Yep. Next one. So I just want to talk a little bit about, let me read some body language. Is this really familiar to you? Some nods, some, okay, great. It's been worth, I think as we go through, there will be other critiques that get less of an airing. This is, the Happy Planet Index is asking different and more useful questions than GDP. GDP just asks the question, what is money flow in the society? The Happy Planet Index measures three things. Anybody here from the New Economics Foundation? So it measures three things. It measures longevity, personal feelings, subjective feelings of well-being, how happy are you, and ecological footprint. Ecological footprint being a composite measure of resource use and waste generation. So effectively the question it's asking is, how much resource do we need to live long, happy lives? That's a more interesting question, isn't it? And the interesting thing that happens is that when they run these analyses, next one, you start getting a list where the Americans and the Brits aren't always on the top. Ah, such a relief. The psychological, I spend much of my working life in rural Africa, and the psychological devastation wreaked by every list in existence always having America, North America, Australia, you know, the white European heartland at the top and everybody else at the bottom. You know, and the story that this feeds into our perception globally is that we're the best, they're pretty crap, but they're on a journey to become a little less crap, and maybe one day they might be as good as us. And this deeply undermines the cultural self-confidence of Africans and Latin Americans, and deeply stimulates unwarranted cultural superiority among Europeans and North Americans. So suddenly to have a question, how much resource do you need to live long, happy lives, a much more useful question, and you find a completely different ordering in the countries. This is really interesting stuff. It's a new form of storytelling. Yeah, next one. And we're going to come back to this phenomenon of Central and South America being leading players, because it's I've had the real privilege in recent years of being able to work in Colombia and Mexico and a number of other Latin American countries, and it seems to me that this is a real hotbed of doing things differently that we'll come back to in a little bit. Yeah, next one. So this is the only graph we're going to see. This is kind of economics like. This is the one graph we're going to see, and I think this asks really interesting questions. So 2 axes. The bottom one is the Human Development Index. The vertical one is the ecological footprint. So the Human Development Index is used it was developed by the United Nations. So it's a measure that does include GDP, but it also includes a composite range of health and education related indicators. So it measures not only the size of the economy, but it measures in addition, access to health facilities, access to educational facilities, literacy rates, and it also balances now to take into account inequality. So a more negative score for highly unequal societies. So this is the Human Development Index, and the dots represent countries colour-coded by region. Ecological footprint, simply resource use. So what we see is that the African countries have a low ecological footprint. This is the global fair share. If everyone in the planet had an ecological footprint lower than this line, we would, at least in the abstract, technically live within the capacity of the Earth systems to self-regenerate. So low polluting, high polluting, and we can see that the African countries do indeed fall generally below the sustainable ecological footprint level. However, their Human Development Index reading is generally very low. So they're not polluting, they're not eating heavily into natural ecosystems, but in terms of access to health, access to education, equality, they're poor countries. Here we find that, I think this is something like the UEA, it's one of the oil-rich Central Asian, Middle Eastern countries. But we find that generally Europe and North American countries do indeed have high Human Development Index, but at the cost of eating into the fabric of the planet. So this is the magic box. Can we find a way of having a high Human Development Index, good access to health, long lives, subjective feelings of well-being, good access to health facilities, without eating the earth? This is a much more interesting question than how much money is flowing through the economy. Now, one country alone hits the box, and that's Cuba. And this is for reasons that Cubans didn't necessarily choose. I mean, any of you who've seen the movie Power of Community, How Cuba Survived Peak Oil, will see that there was a period where the cheap, subsidized Soviet oil on which the Cubans had built the structure of their society, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, they were given 6 months' notice that it was going to end. And so they had to make a rapid transition, and in parallel, the government in the US tightened the noose, meaning that any ship docking at a Cuban port could not dock at a US port. So effectively, Cuba had a crash course in post-collapse scenario. It's a fantastic film, really. I think for those of us who want to find silver linings, it's a very encouraging film. Useful question, isn't it? Does this look more useful than GDP? Like, can we live happy, long, satisfied lives with good access to health and education without eating into the fabric of the planet? And please.
Well, I'm just quite that, for example, the USA, UK, people generally don't come up with that happy. So this Human Development Index.
I mean, I was taking artistic license there. The Human Development Index doesn't actually include subjective feelings of well-being. But nonetheless, actually in the surveys, people in industrialized, advanced countries do generally have high readings of subjective well-being. Next one. Okay, so I want to talk now about some of the other deep critiques of it, really, and really this is calling into question, what do we mean by economics? Anybody heard of this guy? He's a big shot in the Occupy movement. He's an academic, an American, US anarchist. who I think is at UCL. This is a fantastic book. I really, if you're, it's a bit of a tome, it's about 400 pages or so, but I really recommend if you're really into this stuff, go to this. He's an anthropologist, and what he is doing is he's looking at the historical record of how markets emerged and the whole discipline of economics. Effectively, he's taking on the economics profession, and in my reading is really trouncing them single-handed. So he, for example, he will say that the creation myth at the heart of modern economics as we understand it is the primacy of markets and money. So markets and money are were created. The general story is that they were created because barter was inefficient. So barter is where, caveman A has got clubs and caveman B has got skins, and they trade. And as long as there's only two items, two commodities on the market, that works. But as soon as other producers come in with arrowheads or whatever it might be, then it no longer works, because what happens if person A wants what person B has, but person B doesn't want what person A has? And I think, and therefore the emergence of markets and money. And this is a story, I mean, certainly I read this and went, yeah, it's true, wasn't it? And Graeber says, it's an interesting story, but no example anywhere in the anthropological record has found an evidence of this being how markets and money emerged. That actually what happened was that in pre-market economies, goods were distributed largely on the basis of gift and reciprocity. So, for example, he asks us to consider a hunter coming back from the forest with a kill. Now, according to the dominant market and money-based form of economic thinking that we've been brought up with, what he would do is he would bring the meat into the market, he'd set up a stall, and he'd sell to those who could afford it. Now, the anthropological record is that, across cultures, is that what happened was he'd bring it in and he'd give it away, prioritising the elderly, pregnant woman and kids. So that's how goods and services were distributed. And the reason why this happened, he's not suggesting that we give up this idea that we are a competitive and sometimes brutal species. He's simply saying that it makes sense that in a society that hasn't yet developed a welfare state, which is 99.9% repeating of human history, your best survival strategy is to develop a reputation for generosity. And so deep wired into the long tail of human history is this, and countless stories that he recounts in his book of societies being based on the delicious ambiguity of giving gifts and not being given. It's not like this costs 2.73, you give me 2.73, the relationship is terminated, I no longer need you, but rather giving a gift so that at a future date I can come back to you and you've got to play with, is this equivalent to, is it more, is it less? And there being this web and network of reciprocity and obligation within communities. So, for example, this little anecdote, the next one is from the book. Next one. So this is from the Graeber book. Consider the linguist who asked an indigenous hunter from Brazil's Pará tribe why, when he fell some big game, he threw a big feast, letting his guests eat up all the meat in one orgy of indulgence, instead of thriftily drying the meat to save it for the future. In response, the hunter laughed and replied, I store meat in the belly of my brother. So this idea that we are hardwired for gift-giving, generosity, but continually scanning to make sure that there are no free riders. And lots of psychologists and lots of experiments in game theory work setting up games that can test our true responses and motivations, finding again and again and again that we always begin with generosity, but we're checking to make sure that the people who we're generous to are being generous not necessarily to me, but to my community. Next one. So another significant critique of a bastion of the current, keep on talking about the current, the current story that we live within is that we are selfish individualists who are utility maximizing. God, are you a utility maximizer? Horrible phrase. The idea being that we are out for our own, to maximize our own self-interest, and that we are individuals not cooperating with others, not looking to see what others are doing. We're operating as rational, perfectly informed, utility maximizing automatons. That's the story, and it's the basis of the models on which economists are able to fail to predict what happens in our societies. So that's what I mean when I talk about the dominant economic system, in which markets and money and raw economic efficiency are seen as being the principal function of the economic system is to promote efficiency, and efficiency is translated in terms of providing us with a maximum number of consumer goods that we can consume, because our utility is measured in terms of how much we consume. So bollocks to the value of the work and how much we enjoy it. It's not about work, that's a disutility. We work in order to get the money to do the stuff we really want to do. So, and this was Fritz Schumacher's big critique, was he spent a lot of time, Fritz Schumacher wrote Small is Beautiful, and it's in his name that Schumacher College is created. And he went to, particularly spent time in India and Bhutan. You know, this is no sandal-wearing green. He was the chief economist of the Coal Board, the National Coal Board. So he was very much 1 foot directly in the dominant economic system. But he spent time in India and Burma, in Buddhist cultures. And what he saw there was that meaningful work was the principal ways in which we get meaning, which we derive meaning. And so the dignity of work is, you know, that the person who has dignity and meaning in their work but is not materially rich will be much wealthier in absolute terms than someone who earns a lot of money but the focus is on consuming. So that's what I mean by the dominant economic system, measuring wealth in terms of money flow and consumerism. So a big part, during a lot of the time that I was working in Africa, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were driving home policies that were largely focused on privatization, moving resources away from community control towards private corporate control. And a big piece of research that they used, it actually wasn't research, it was an assertion, there was no fieldwork involved in this, was something called the tragedy of the commons, which is, it's enter the language. Have you heard this phrase, the tragedy of the commons? You know, it's so insidiously found its way into the language, and the story being, the story as Garrett Hardin, the author, tells it, is that it's in everyone's self-interest to put more sheep on the commons than the commons can withstand. So the individual self-interest would be to put more of your sheep onto the commons to graze than the commons will be able to withstand, and therefore all common, what are called common pool resource regimes, all community managed resources are bound to decay and to be overexploited. And so this piece of research, this assertion in this paper, strongly informed World Bank, International Monetary Fund, government policies across the world, that you had to take resources out of community control and put them into the control of private interests, which generally meant corporations. Yeah, next one. So then this woman turns up and says, actually, again, looking at the anthropological evidence, this simply is not the case. That there are countless examples over millennia of communities policing the resource themselves. Whether it's woodland, fisheries, forestries, even very famous case studies on Lake Victoria, which is a huge lake in Central America, with a number of different countries speaking different languages adjoining Lake Victoria, and even in the case of the fisheries of Lake Victoria, successful transnational community sustainable management of the resource. Again, another example which is really personally painful is that in southern Spain, the Moors, the Arab people who were in southern Spain, developed exquisitely refined water irrigation systems. It's an area, the Alpujarras in southern Spain, it's an area that doesn't get much rainfall. But the system of canals and irrigation and the traditions around when you open the gates and when you close them were exquisitely designed to respond to the needs of a very delicately balanced ecosystem. Managed by the communities, not by the government, not by the municipalities, by the communities themselves. In the space of 3 decades of neoliberal privatization, that water resource has been smashed because that land and the water were sold into private hands, and effectively for the last 30 years, Spain, the Alpujarras, have been exporting water to us in the form of tasteless tomatoes that we spend all winter having this idea that we're somehow eating tomatoes. And it's actually Spain, it's this beautiful area that now is one of the few human artifacts that can be seen from the moon, is the miles of polytunnels in southern Spain which are just sucking up the water to send them to northern Europe in the name of economic efficiency and tasteless red vegetables. So this whole, the new emerging stories, the rebirth of the concept of the commons as this whole territory beyond the market and the state, the commons where communities have this millennia-long tradition of managing successfully their own resources. Yeah. I'm particularly fascinated by Latin America, and this concept of buen vivir coming out of Latin America, very much drawing on their unbroken indigenous tradition, this long, I think it's something that we in Northern Europe have to rediscover, our indigenous roots, whereas in Central America there are communities that have, with an unbroken lineage, linking them to a deep understanding of of our true nature as a web, as a thread in the web of life. They have this the indigenous wisdom deeply holds them into this, it's not an abstract concept, it's a deeply lived experience of the mutual their dependence of human beings on Pachamama, on Mother Earth. Next one, please. So another critique, we're coming up to the halfway point. And this is from health practitioners looking at the impacts of equality on societal well-being. Now, the dominant story of neoliberal economics, which is the dominant form that both the Labour Party and Tony Blair was the great promoter of globalisation in neoliberal economics, as was Bill Clinton. So this is not a traditional left-right division, it's the dominant paradigm within which all the political parties, other than the Green Party, are currently embedded. The dominant story is that the phrase is, a rising tide lifts all boats. So it doesn't matter if the very rich are getting hugely richer, as long as everybody's getting a little bit richer. So as long as everybody's getting a little bit richer, it doesn't matter what the relative inequality is within a community. Now, again, look at the anthropological research that David Graeber was talking about, where the importance of relationship and reciprocity in your place in the community is critically important to our experience and well-being, and it's a direct contradiction. So these two health practitioners wrote this wonderful book called The Spirit Level, which is mostly a book on statistical analysis. And so in every case, income inequality is always in the lower axis. So at one end, the highly equal countries, Japan, Scandinavia, and this is the Anglo-American model here, the UK, US, New Zealand, Portugal, countries that have followed the capitalism red and tooth and claw path, highly unequal societies. And this one graph is simply a composite of all these different measures. Each one of these in the book will have its own separate graph. This is just a composite measure looking at seeing the significance of income inequality in relation to these different variables. And graph after graph after graph after graph after graph shows that the more unequal societies have higher numbers of prisoners, more use of antidepressants, more teenage pregnancies, more, I mean, just read the list, obesity, mental illness, drug addiction, on and on and on and on and on. Even, interestingly, social mobility. And the woman who authored this came and spoke at Schumacher College not too long ago, and she said, one of the things, the most striking thing she said was that she was talking to a group of, an audience in Chicago, and she said, the obvious response to this is, if you want to live the American dream, you need to emigrate to Copenhagen. In other words, the social mobility is lowest in the countries with highly unequal income variables. Next one. Another significant thinker, Daniel Kahneman, won the economics, what's called the Nobel Prize for Economics. Again, just completely rubbishing. He's a very senior psychologist looking at what really makes people tick and how people really work, and saying this notion that we are individuals not influenced by other people in our society is obvious nonsense, and showing the ways in which, for example, he earned his Nobel Prize for bringing insights from psychology into how stock markets stampede, how the traders are so profoundly influenced by each other's activities that rather than it being a rational self-correcting system, they simply stampede. So yeah, a couple of, next to here, this is just an interesting, and to me this is so obvious we don't need to spend much time on, but this is a really interesting little experiment. I was talking about psychologists coming up with these games to really identify what really makes us tick. This is working with a group of students, and they were asked to rank downloads, music tracks, just to rank them, but they couldn't see how the others were ranking. And this was the general pattern. They listened to the music and then they ranked them, but they weren't able to see how the others were ranking. The next slide was what happened when they were able to see how others were ranking. Next one. So clearly, when we can see others' responses, it affects our own response. I mean, it's so obvious. But this experiment just really, it's a neat little experiment that shows that we are clearly herd animals. Next one. Oh. Yeah, okay. Chilean thinker called Manfred Max Neef. Well, we're coming towards the end of the section on critiques of how we do economics at the moment and how we understand it. Then we're going to go on to the good news after the conversation and a pee break. Really interesting Chilean economist called Manfred Max Neef, who suggests, he himself is an economist but deeply dissatisfied with, he was working as a consultant for the World Bank and going, this is nonsense, and really stepping back and really asking intelligent questions about who are we as a species and what is well-being for us. And he suggests that we have, that all people across all cultures have 9 core human needs that are interconnected. They don't stand alone. And they're these: subsistence, protection, participation, leisure, affection, understanding, creation, identity, freedom. Now, he's not fundamentalist about this. He's saying this is his proposal, that fundamentally these are core human needs, but the critical insight being that the way that we satisfy these needs is culturally determined. And we happen to live in a society where the advertising industry has very cleverly attached the consumption of products to the satisfaction of specific needs. And if you actually take this table and sit down and look at your, if you're unfortunate enough to have a television, just look at the advertising and just tick the boxes as you see the satisfaction of these needs linked to the consumption of particular products. And I must say that coming across this made a lot of sense for me of living in rural Africa in communities that were financially poor, but my experience of them was that in many senses they were much richer and more fulfilled than I was finding in the societies that I was living in here. Not to romanticize the rural African lifestyle, but this idea that the universal is the core human needs, and there are many ways of meeting these needs that are not at all connected to consumerism. And particularly this one, I keep coming back to this one. This is the one where I think participation, that our current economy is weakest, that we are not participants, we are passive. And it seems to me this is the heart of our societal malaise, is that we are not engaged in really anything. Like we tick a box once every 4 years, and apart from that, you know, you've got to try really hard to be an engaged, involved. I mean, I think probably the folks sitting here, if the invitations have gone out to NGOs and civic society organisations, it's probably a self-selecting group. But the big problem that I see in coming back from Africa to this society is simply the level of passivity and lack of active engagement in framing our own lives. And I think that was what I found in West Africa, was just how vibrant and dynamic and alive it felt because people really weren't participating. Next one. Oh my God, complexity theory. We're going to split just 2 minutes in this, that really every discipline, every academic discipline has taken on complexity theory except for economics. The idea being that we do not live again, the dominant story in economics is that we live within largely stable systems that tend towards equilibrium, where there's linear cause and effect. It's too deep a story to go into, but that effectively we live in a much more complex world, in which, you know, I'm going to recommend that you follow. We could spend the next hour on this now. We're already running over time, so I'm not going to say much more about complexity theory, except to say that it's yet another discipline that has been knocking on the doors of economics, and the economists have said, this is just, if we take what you're saying on board, we can no longer model. Because we need to model, we're going to continue to do it the way we're doing it. Can I say anything useful more on this in the time available? Yeah, so just one more thing, that economics really became, in its early first maybe century and a half, it was primarily a field of moral philosophy. Adam Smith himself was a professor of moral philosophy. It was really asking value-driven questions. Like Karl Marx, for example, very much in this tradition, saying the point is not to understand the world, it is to change it. This is about visioning the better society and actively working towards those goals. In the late 19th century, economics became a so-called value-free scientific mathematical discipline. And following Newtonian physics and this idea that somehow we live in, that the world is a machine that we can stand apart from and manipulate. And even today, in the fields of physics and mathematics, to say this is complete nonsense. Quantum physics points to the dance of atoms and that things are much less solid and predictable than we imagine. It's completely fascinating critique, but the core point again, as with what the anthropologist said, as with what the health practitioner said, as with what the psychologist said, we're not even going to go there, because if we do, it undermines the whole basis of the discipline. Yeah, next one. Okay, so this is the penultimate slide. This is a wonderful book. I recommend this one as well. The Origin of Wealth, Evolution, Complexity, and the Radical Remaking of Economics. So the myth of the purely self-interested human takes a hit. Empirical studies find that human behaviour is not selfish, but rather attuned to eliciting cooperation, social networks, rewarding cooperation, and punishing freeriders. Pause. So there was a lot of stuff there, but it felt important to that at the moment the field of economics it's a mathematical science that makes assumptions about the human condition and what equates to well-being, that anthropologists, that psychologists, that health practitioners, that scientists in the field of complexity and others are saying this simply isn't who we are as a species. So, calling into question the whole foundation and basis of how economics is currently understood, taught and practiced. This is Henry Ford production line, introduction of mass production, and you can imagine that this the story emerging from what psychologists, neuroscientists, anthropologists, sociologists tell us of this species, us, who are watching what others are doing, we're attuned to our social networks, we're looking for free riders, we're creative, playful, reciprocal. This is what the evidence shows, and you can imagine, like, the history of capitalism from the dark satanic minutes onwards has been taking this somewhat creative, playful, sense-making species and shoved them into a box that really doesn't fit at all. And it seems to me the history of capitalism so far has been one of pushing the foot of humanity into a silver slipper that just doesn't fit it at all. And certainly the experience of the early experience of Henry Ford's factories was that they had to pay their workers substantially more than elsewhere, than in other competing workplaces. The story that is told by the in the tradition of the entrepreneurial heroes of capitalism was that Henry Ford paid them more so that they would be able to afford to buy his cars. But in truth, in the early days, they had to pay them more because the people hated the work so much that they simply would sign up for a week and then they'd leave. Because this is not who we are as a species. And what I want to suggest in the remainder of the presentation, and I'm aware this is a kind of an extraordinary suggestion, but it's only a suggestion. It's not saying this is inevitable, but the suggestion is that we're entering a technological revolution that for the first time in the history of capitalism may just play to our strengths as collaborative, reciprocating, creative, playful beings. That it seems to me this is not this is not wishful thinking. There's a real there are signs that we are entering one of the cyclical periods of technological revolution in the history of capitalism that for the first time in 300 years may play to our strengths as creative networkers and reciprocators. And that's going to be the story I'm going to tell for the rest of this presentation. Next one. So this is I'm throwing out lots of books here in the hope that you may feel inspired to pick some of them up. This is a guy called Jeremy Rifkin, who is a senior consultant to the European Union. This book is called The Third Industrial Revolution. I just want to take a little body check here. Anybody read this book? Anybody heard of this book? You've heard. Okay. Strongly recommend it again. So the Third Industrial Revolution economy embodies the spirit of the social entrepreneurial movement sweeping the globe. Being both entrepreneurial and cooperative is no longer considered a contradiction, but rather a prescription for reordering economic, social and political life in the 21st century. In industry after industry, networks are competing with markets and open source commons are challenging proprietary business operations. And what I want to do with the rest of the presentation is to run through what this battle, so the battle he's pointing to is that between 20th century organisational forms, which are pyramid-shaped, top-down, command and control, surviving behind intellectual property protection, and comparing that to 21st century organisational forms which are internet-enabled and are much more networked and collaborative, as we'll see. We're going to go through sector by sector. Next one. Yeah. Just a little bit of economic theory. This is a Venezuelan economist called Carlos Perez, who points to, maybe the next one shows it better, points to waves this is called long wave theory. The idea that about every 50 years or so, a suite of technologies turns up that have the potential to completely revolutionise everything in society, not just within this particular sectors, but throughout the society. And that suite of technologies tends to include an energy technology and a communication technology. So the last great wave to come through, she reckons we're about here, but the last great wave to come through was the age of automobiles, oil and mass production. So it was enabled, the telecommunications and oil were the two big drivers. And it enabled the building of the suburbs, whole infrastructure, mass education to be able to create a class of people to manage the entire systems. Really every facet of life, from health, the welfare state, education, housing, town planning, on and on. The society was completely revolutionised by this suite of technologies coming along that really changed everything. And she would say, and she's not alone in this, I think that this is becoming increasingly understood, that at the moment a suite of technologies, including renewable energy and the internet, are in the process of that we're in process to have another, that we're already seeing the early signs of this, go back one, of this life and death struggle between the old organisational form that has reached maturity and the new one that is coming in. Sorry, the new one that's coming in, the next surge. Go on to the next one. No, sorry, go back one. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just to give you a few words on it. Again, Carlota Perez, you can find this on the internet. She's made a lot of YouTube videos, and yeah, you can dive into this in more detail. But the idea being that a new organisational form turns up, that speculative capital pours into the new emerging forms as the investors can see that this really is the shape of the future. But the investment comes in much more quickly and in much greater volumes than the nascent industries can possibly absorb. And this is the dot-com bubble. So massive investment, a bubble forms. It becomes clear that at the moment there's a lot of talk and not much pajama, because they just haven't been able to develop because of the power of the existing form of organisation. So there's a crash, and I must say I love historical references, because it puts our little moment. At the moment, it's easy for people doing what kind of work we're doing to become pretty desperate, and you actually look at the long historical record, and we've been here. We haven't quite been here before, because there are new things, but there are many things happening here that happened here and here and here and here. And they include bankers going mad, huge gap between the rich and the poor, lots of the old regime desperately trying to hold on, but lots of innovation within new ways of doing things. So this is a recurring pattern. Much of what we're living through at the moment we have seen in similar moments of previous waves. Next one. Robin Murray is a very distinguished teacher. He's one of our teachers at the college, and he has this to say: centralized versus dispersed. This is a battle that is even more profound than that between the private and public sectors. This battle is being fought out in food and agriculture, healthcare, water, education, medicine, and above all in the finance sector. And what I'm hoping to do in this next little section is to tell the stories of some of these different sectors, so that we can better locate ourselves within this moment of history and become more intelligent lobbyists and activists. Yeah, we're going to start by looking at finance. This is a recent piece in The Guardian, and I've put it in there because of this very interesting quote, which we seem to have lost a little bit of. The growing disillusion with big banks has led the Bank of England's Andy Haldean to conclude the model banking culture we have had since the 1990s is on its way out. Instead, we are seeing a much more diverse ecosystem emerging with the growth of new non-bank groups offering peer-to-peer lending, crowdfunding, which are operating directly with the wider public. So that's right. So the idea that if we look at the finance sector, that the 20th century model is clearly the bank. It's the dominant organisation drawing power and wealth to itself and having pretty much a monopoly of deciding what is going to get funded. Because I'm sure this, you have seen Money is Debt. Let's have some heads now. You haven't seen Money is Debt? A little film called Money is Debt. Please watch it. 98% of money in circulation is generated in the form of bank loans. So the banks really allocate a money supply, and they allocate it to the most profitable and therefore almost by definition the most destructive economic activities. And so this has dominated the finance sector in the 20th century. And what this is suggesting is that we're seeing a whole different way of doing finance, which is peer-to-peer. Anybody been involved in crowdfunding initiatives? Next one. So crowdfunding, meaning that you're setting up a business, you're running a project, you're making a film. Instead of going to the bank for one big loan, you use the internet to source multiple small loans. Next one. A growing number of websites that are specifically geared to ethical, social economy projects and initiatives. This is called Traid. Next one. Kiva linking up small-scale lenders around the world with small-scale microfinance entrepreneurs in the global south. Next one. You're going to see this again and again, that it's true that at the moment the banks still dominate the financial sector, but the crowdfunding, the alternative peer-to-peer forms of financing are exponentially increasing. You know, it's just arriving on the map, but this is the exponential trend. So this is like trying to be an historian of the present, like trying to to identify what are the key trends that are happening now that historians in the near future will look back on and say this was the key stuff that was happening. This is definitely one. Next one. Also community currencies. This is the community currency that I helped to launch at Findhorn, the eco-village I lived in Scotland. Very much a lot of beards and sandals and quite a few hippies up there. But now, next one. This is Brixton, the Bristol pound. The mayor of Bristol takes 100% of his salary in Bristol pounds. You can pay council tax, you can pay business rates in a currency created by the community itself with nothing to do with the bank. Next one. And it's not just in the global north, this is from Kenya. It's very much a global phenomenon. The rise of peer-to-peer finances and currency systems to give liquidity to communities that otherwise don't have it because the banks have ignored them. Yep. Okay, so that's finance. This is energy. This is from a report written by the Centre for Alternative Technology called Zero Carbon Britain. This is how we currently do energy in Britain. The 20th century model, the power station. Huge power station at the centre of the system. This one is conversion, transmission and distribution losses. Vastly inefficient. Now we have the technology already to do it quite differently. Next one. This is how we could be doing it. You're not going to be able to read in detail. I mean, Zero Carbon Britain is free, downloadable from the internet, and this simply describes multiple dispersed, localized energy generating sources that using currently existing technology, we could organize it like this. Next one. The emergence of smart grids. There's even the suggestion that with the advances in photovoltaic energy, which is dramatically reducing in price and increasing in the proportion of the sun's light that is able to convert into usable energy, and also in storage systems, there are certain commentators that are saying that actually off-grid systems where communities store with their own batteries may well be competitive, may well outcompete the national grid within a couple of decades. Yep, next one. This again is from Nafiz Ahmad, that article in The Guardian that I mentioned before. Renewable skeptics are simply wrong, obsessed with the slow, centralized economic dynamics of fossil fuels rather than understanding the unique distributed dynamics of the new. In Germany, for example, where 25% of the grid is powered by decentralized renewables, over 50% of which is owned by citizens, the three largest utilities are struggling with what the CEO of one of them called the worst structural crisis in the history of energy supply. A new report by Colorado's Rocky Mountain Institute suggests that if renewables continue to be adopted this aggressively, off-grid systems would prove cheaper than all utility sold electricity in the region just a decade out from today. This is significant stuff. This is real game-changing, disruptive stuff. And I have to say that coming from a community background, I've always been something of a techno-skeptic, kind of thinking, you know, people who look to technology for the answers are a bit superficial. And besides, techno-optimists have always been harping on about nuclear and GM, which seems to me make little sense. But I'm finding that despite myself, that even though I continue to be primarily interested in the power of social innovation, I'm seeing increasingly that the technology and the shape of the technological revolution we're moving into is making is facilitating the process of social innovation, and that actually the technology has a critical role to play. Next one. So we're seeing a growing number of local renewable energy companies funded by share offers, where members in the community buy shares in local renewable energy projects, increasing their own energy security and earning a dividend as the facilities begin to generate electricity. Next one. Local employment in Germany. Germany has really taken the lead in the state intervening and really pushing the photovoltaic industry. And there are 600,000 people currently working, estimated to work in the renewable energy sector in Germany. Yep, next one. This is Findhorn, the community I lived in Scotland, where the community is a net exporter of renewable energy, and a substantial amount of the investment that put up these turbines was generated by members of the community buying shares in the park. But it's, once again, I've kind of deliberately put these two slides, juxtaposed them, because what used to be stuck in the hippie fringe is now moving mainstream. And this idea of citizens coming together to, even on a municipal scale, to invest in taking control of their own energy infrastructure. And once again, with Germany taking a big lead. Berlin and Hamburg, the citizens in Berlin and Hamburg are both engaged in community share issues to enable them to take over ownership and control of their own grids. Yep. Next one. So again, another really important book that's just come out, Jeremy Leggett, long-time campaigner on renewable energy issues, the creator of an organisation called Solar Century. In Germany, nearly 55% of the land area comprises regions with declared energy autonomous targets, intentions and processes in place. By the end of 2012, over 600 clean energy cooperatives have been set up in Germany, many of them revolving around wind and solar. Denmark produces a quarter of its energy from wind power, largely generated from turbines owned by more than 2,000 cooperatives. So this has left the fringes of eco-communards trying to do something on a small scale. And I think that's where a lot of the seeds were sown, but this is moving onto the map as a serious disruptor and challenge to the current dominant 20th century centralized command and control system. Yep. This is in Thessalonica. Going to be doing some work in Greece, and this campaign, Thessalonica 136, the municipal, in the face of the economic crisis, the municipal water system is up for grabs. And I suspect this is more propaganda. I don't think this is really going to happen, but they've used the number 136 because as a campaigning tool, saying that if every citizen, if every adult in Thessalonica put 136 euros into the pot, the citizens could take control. They would win the tender to take control of their own water supply. Next one. Next one. So we're going to move into the sector in which this battle between 20th century and 21st century forms is most obvious in open source technology, open source software. I love this quote. Open source is doing for mass innovation what the assembly line did for mass production. The idea being that, again, if you look at the 20th century corporation, that the potential for innovations is limited to the paid employees of the corporation, protected by the patent, intellectual property, boundary, whereas within open source systems, anybody can contribute. And so consequently, when you look at the long-term competitiveness of systems that are based on often somewhat unwilling wage slaves, compared to an internet-enabled open space for innovation where people are choosing to contribute exactly what they want to contribute, the latter looks like it is more than a fighting chance. Next one. This is, again, open source software. A report by the Standish Group from 2008 states that the adoption of open source software has resulted in annual savings of about $60 billion to consumers. And the next one. I mean, it's clear that open source has really won the battle. That even IBM, I read recently that the director of Microsoft said they cannot compete in the software. As a software company, they're done. They've got to find other things to do because the open source collaborative development is simply, it's cheaper and it's much more efficient. Next one. So we're seeing the same thing in transport. A really important distinction here is between ownership and access. So I've been really lucky that for the last 15, I love driving, but for the last 15 years I haven't had to own a car because I've lived in communities that have carpools. And this idea of moving, that I personally don't actually want a ton of metal and glass sitting outside my house. That doesn't turn me on at all. But I want access to mobility. And again, lots of really interesting internet-enabled ways of facilitating mobility at a fraction of the ecological cost, because not every consumer needs to own a car. So again, lovely quote, the car-sharing business model represents a disruptive revolution in the nature of mobility, transforming the automobile from a private possession to a collective convenience and from an autonomous experience to a collaborative enterprise. Now, once again, we're finding the use, go to the next one. Blah blah cars, facilitating shares, that some data down here, facilitating collaborative people cooperating to give each other lifts across Europe, rather than, I mean, in competition to public transport, they see public transport as being the biggest single competitor. So the internet enabling those with resources and those who need access to the resources to link in ways that really works for them and that greatly reduces the need for each individual to own a car. This will, I mean, it's already taking off, it's going exponentially, it will go even more so as the economic crisis eats in, because who can afford a car? Next one. Food hubs, I love this one, because the 20th century has been so, the 20th century food industry has been so dominated by Walmart, Tesco, Cargill, Monsanto, and what has happened is that I mean, I think you'll all be aware of this, that a growing number of people are walking into their delicatessen, their restaurant, their shops and saying, is this local? And until very recently, the shop owner or the restaurant owner would have said, you know, I wish it was, but the transaction costs of trying to negotiate with 20 different local suppliers is simply too high. So we go to Tesco and we simply buy it all in one morning and it's done. Now we're seeing the emergence of something called the food hub. It's a generic term rather than a very specific model, but the food hub, at the heart of the food hub model is an internet, a platform interface that enables real-time communication between people who want food, whether they're households or hospitals or schools or delicatessens or restaurants, and the local suppliers in an area. So those who are, let's say for example, in a delicatessen in a restaurant, they're posting exactly what their demands are. This is what we need every day, every week, and the local suppliers are able to match their production to that demand, and again use the food hub, which also tends to have refrigeration and storage facilities and processing facilities to meet the demand of the local, to meet the local demand from local supply. And again, I think if you look at the emerging picture, that I have a certain amount of sympathy for you know, the boardrooms of these huge corporations are needing to manage increasingly fragile and crisis-prone long supply chains. So droughts, climate-related events, rising energy and transport costs, and a lot of the links in the supply chain that aren't adding value in the global supply chain. So if you think of the injecting produce to keep it to extend its life, the long distance transport, the advertising, the wholesaling, there's so many of the links in the chain that cost but don't add value that is incurred by the global food system that isn't incurred by the local system. So we use one of these food hubs in Totnes, and the food that it produces comes from within 5 miles, fabulous quality, and it's cheaper than the local supermarket, organic food. And I think we will see this growing trend that the global supply chains are going to find it ever more difficult to be competitive against networked, collaborating local producers. And this is a map just of the emergence in recent years of food hubs in one region of the US. Again, it's barely on the map, but the trend is exponential. Education surely is exempt. Towering the spires, Oxford. I'm afraid not. Next one. Just going to let you read that one. I mean, effectively there is disruption throughout society. It's not what the newspapers are reporting on, but in every sector you look at, there is disruption enabled by the internet and renewable energy technology that pose a major challenge to the corporate form that has dominated the 20th century. Yeah, next one.
What do you mean disruptional education? What do you mean by disruptional education?
Disruptional education. Go back one. So the key drivers here are that the 20th century model is at the heart of the system is the university. And the student signs up to the university and does the programs prescribed by the university. It's increasingly expensive, so a big driver is students no longer being prepared to take on student loans. Another disruptor is the emergence of MOOCs, massive open online courses. Another one being that increasingly employers and employer surveys, they're reporting back, particularly in the field of economics, but not only saying, you know, the graduates you're producing are just no use. They're not what we need. We need people with creative, problem-solving, team-working skills. And actually you're giving us people with outmoded 20th century models. So, that's it. Students increasingly unprepared to take on loans for work that increasingly isn't there, particularly when the employers don't value the education.
What's the alternative?
What's the alternative?
Things up in summers when you want to do.
Did you know there's so many? Invite me back and we'll just have one session on revolutionary education.
Yeah, sorry, I mean we're almost on time, so if we can. I mean I don't know how. It would be great to have like at least 10 minutes for questions and comments. So
but are we going to 9 o'clock?
And then we carry on in the pub.
Indeed. Are we going to 9 o'clock? Or to
at 8:30 or yeah, well we are already at 8:30. I don't know how people feel to carry on like everyone is happy. I mean
we're just going to risk this.
Yeah.
But do we have to be out of here at 9?
Sorry?
Do we have to leave?
At some point I think that yes. Yeah, I mean it's more that if people have plans to finish at 8:30, but if everyone is happy we can.
We'll keep going. Actually there isn't much more to go. Okay, so let's just keep going. Let's race through.
Next one, sorry. Yeah.
So the 20th century organisational form in work being the work corporate office, the 21st century organisational form being the hub, where people, next one, come together in maker spaces, in fab labs, in all sorts of new collaborative ways of working. Yep. I've got too much material. Just keep going.
Yes. Next time.
Increasing focus not on the individual enterprise but on enterprise clusters, looking to see where the waste produce from one system becomes the nutrient for the next. So thinking systemically, like ecosystems of enterprises. Next one. Yeah, next one. Next one. Okay, very quick. 20th century organisational form. Next one. 21st century organisational form. Yeah. Increasing proliferation of higher hubs. The average power drill in Britain is used for an average of how many minutes? 22 minutes is the average life of a power drill. Completely insane. So a growing number of hiring sites. Yep. Yep. Really interesting article. I'm not going to say anything more about it other than just point you to it. It came out last week in The Guardian. Next one. Okay, so the last couple of slides. This is from the Rifkin article. A growing legion, this is the same, the third industrial revolution guy. A growing legion of prosumers, linking of producers and consumers, is producing and sharing information, not only knowledge, news and entertainment, but also renewable energy, 3D printed products, online courses at near zero marginal costs on the collaborative commons. They're even sharing cars, homes, clothes and tools, entirely bypassing the conventional capitalist market. An increasingly streamlined and savvy capitalist system will continue to operate at the edges of the new economy, finding sufficient vulnerabilities to exploit, primarily as an aggregator of network services and solutions, allowing it to flourish as a powerful niche player. But it will no longer reign. Hundreds of millions of people are already transferring bits and pieces of their lives from capitalist markets to the emerging global collaborative commons, operating on a ubiquitous Internet of Things platform. The great economic paradigm shift has begun. We don't have time. Next one. Next one. And this is the final one. This goes back to this article that I pointed you to before. And this is the closing quote. This new paradigm of distributed clean energy production, decentralized farming and participatory economic cooperation offers a model of development free from the imperative of endless growth for its own sake. And it leads us to directly to a new model of democracy based not on large-scale hierarchical control, but on the wholesale decentralization of power towards smaller local ownership and decision-making. So just a closing comment is that there's nothing inevitable of this. I began by saying this is not the truth, this is not how the future is going to look. But the trends are there, and we're living through the early days of a revolution that's not being mirrored back to us. It's not encoded in our language and in our dominant stories. And it seems to me that a big part of the work, like going back to the first quote about the failure of imagination, it's about that I sometimes wonder in our economics class in Schumacher College, if an outsider came in and had to guess what we were studying, I think they'd often say storytelling or linguistics, that it's really about joining up the dots in ways that makes more sense of the transition we're living through. And I hope this evening has, and will continue in the pub, to provoke searching, critiques, questions, ideas about how all this plays out in the sectors that you're working in.
Thank you.